The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a thick fog rolling through the ancient oaks like the breath of some forgotten beast. It was 1858, in the shadowed fringes of a Georgia plantation, where the cries of the auction block still echoed in Daniel's ears long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. He had stood there, chains biting into his wrists, helpless as the gavel fell once, twice, 3 times, his wife Eliza's eyes locking onto his in silent agony, their 2 children clinging to her skirts, small faces twisted in confusion and terror. Sold. Scattered to distant fields, perhaps never to be seen again. The world had shattered in that moment, leaving him a hollow shell, adrift in the relentless cruelty of men who traded lives like livestock. But that night, as he lay in the stifling quarters, something stirred. A whisper, faint at first, slithering through the cracks in the wooden walls. Not the wind, not the rustle of nocturnal creatures, no, this was different. Voices, layered and indistinct, murmuring promises laced with peril. Come, they seemed to say, follow us into the dark, where the impossible waits. Daniel bolted upright, heart pounding, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill. Was it madness? The grief twisting his mind into knots? Or something older, something woven into the very roots of the land? The woods loomed just beyond the fields, a forbidden tangle of gnarled branches and thorny underbrush that slaves whispered about in hushed tones. Tales of wanderers who entered and never returned, of lights flickering without source, of echoes that mimicked lost loved ones. Daniel had dismissed them as superstitions, born of fear and exhaustion. But now, with nothing left to lose, the voices pulled at him like an invisible thread. He slipped from his bunk, the dirt floor cold under his bare feet, and stole into the night. The moon cast pale slivers through the canopy as he plunged deeper, the path narrowing until it was swallowed by shadows. Every snap of a twig underfoot sent his pulse racing, every hoot of an owl sounding like a warning. The voices grew clearer now, weaving through the trees fragments of songs his Eliza used to hum, the laughter of his children echoing faintly. Yet beneath it all lurked a darker undercurrent, a low rumble that vibrated in his bones, hinting at secrets buried long ago. What mystery hid in these woods? What impossible act could reunite a broken man with his stolen family? As the fog thickened, closing in like fingers around his throat, Daniel pressed on, unaware that the true horror was not in the loss he had suffered, but in the revelations waiting to unfold. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty auction ground outside Savannah that sweltering afternoon in 1858, the air thick with the stench of sweat, fear, and the faint metallic tang of chains. Hundreds had gathered, planters in fine linen suits, traders with calculating eyes, overseers barking orders, while the enslaved stood in ragged lines, heads bowed, waiting for their fates to be decided by the highest bidder. Daniel stood among them, his broad shoulders hunched, wrists raw from the iron manacles that had bound him since dawn. He was 32, strong from years toiling in the rice fields, but in that moment he felt smaller than the children huddled at his feet. Beside him stood Eliza, his wife of 10 years, her once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion and dread. She held their daughter Ruth close against her hip, the 6-year-old's small fingers twisting into the frayed fabric of her mother's dress. Their son Josiah, barely 4, clung to Daniel's leg, whimpering softly as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Daniel's heart thundered in his chest, each beat a silent plea that somehow, by some miracle, they would not be separated. They had whispered prayers together the night before, clinging to one another in the dim quarters, promising that no matter what happened, their love would endure. But promises felt fragile now, like dry leaves ready to crumble underfoot. The auctioneer mounted his platform, voice booming as he began the sales. One by one, families were torn apart, mothers ripped from infants, husbands from wives, siblings divided without a second thought. Daniel watched it all in numb horror, his stomach churning as the gavel cracked like gunfire. When their turn came, Eliza was called first. She turned to him, tears streaming down her cheeks, and pressed a hurried kiss to his lips. "Keep strong," she whispered, voice breaking. "Remember us." Ruth reached out tiny arms toward him, crying "Papa" as Eliza was pulled away. The bidding was swift, ruthless. A planter from South Carolina claimed her and the children together, a small mercy that felt like none at all. Daniel lunged forward instinctively, chains rattling, but a sharp blow from an overseer's whip sent him staggering back. He could only watch, helpless, as Eliza and the children were led to the buyer's wagon. Eliza looked back one last time, her gaze locking with his across the widening distance, a look of unbearable sorrow, love, and farewell. Ruth's sobs carried on the hot wind, Josiah's confused wails piercing Daniel's soul like knives. Then the wagon rolled away, dust rising in its wake, swallowing them until they were gone. When the gavel fell the final time, sealing their separation, something inside Daniel shattered. The world blurred, sounds muffled, as if he were underwater. He was sold separately, to a plantation farther inland, but it barely registered. All he could feel was the gaping void where his family had been moments before, the weight of a future without their voices, their touch, their warmth. Despair settled over him like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. As the reality sank in, they were lost to him, scattered across a cruel land that cared nothing for their bonds. Night had fallen heavy and starless over the plantation, the kind of darkness that pressed against the skin like damp cloth. Daniel lay on the thin straw pallet in the cramped quarters, his body aching from the day's forced labor, but it was nothing compared to the raw wound in his chest. The auction replayed endlessly behind his closed eyes, Eliza's final glance, Ruth's outstretched arms, Josiah's bewildered cries fading into dust. Sleep refused him. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant cough from neighboring cabins, felt like mockery. The other men around him breathed slow and steady, exhausted into oblivion, but Daniel's mind churned with a grief so sharp it seemed it might split him open. Then it came, a sound so soft he thought at first it was the blood rushing in his ears. A whisper, barely more than a sigh, threading through the gaps in the rough-hewn walls. He froze, breath caught, straining to hear. It came again, clearer now, sliding across the dirt floor like fingers tracing letters in dust. Not one voice, but many, overlapping in a low, insistent murmur that rose and fell like wind through tall grass. Words were indistinct at first, yet they carried an unmistakable pull, a cadence that tugged at something deep inside him. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the others, his heart hammering against his ribs. The whispers grew bolder, weaving around him, brushing against his ears with chilling intimacy. Fragments surfaced, come, deeper, find, spoken in tones that shifted from pleading to commanding. They were not the voices of the living, there was an ancient quality to them, layered with sorrow and secrets long buried. Daniel's skin prickled as a cold draft snaked through the room, though the night outside was still and humid. He pressed his palms to his ears, willing the sounds to stop, terrified that grief had finally driven him mad. But closing his ears only made the voices sharper inside his skull, resonating in his bones, promising impossible things: reunion, restoration, a path through the unthinkable. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill that accompanied the murmurs. The forbidden woods lay just beyond the cotton fields, a dense wall of shadow no slave dared enter after dusk. Stories passed in hushed tones around evening fires spoke of those woods as cursed, alive with restless spirits and treacherous paths that led wanderers in circles until exhaustion claimed them. Yet now the whispers seemed to rise from that very direction, beckoning him toward the tree line with a persistence that bordered on hunger. Daniel rose to his knees, trembling, torn between terror and a desperate, flickering hope. The voices swirled closer, coiling around his despair like vines, offering a thread in the darkness if he dared to follow. The plantation slept uneasily under a moonless sky, the only sounds the distant croak of frogs and the occasional restless shift of livestock in the pens. Daniel waited until the snores of the men around him deepened into the heavy rhythm of true exhaustion, his body coiled tight with a fear he could taste like iron on his tongue. The whispers still lingered in his ears, no longer faint but insistent, threading through the walls as if the night itself were speaking directly to him. They pulled at him with a force that felt almost physical, urging him toward the door, toward the open fields, toward the black wall of trees that marked the edge of everything he knew. He rose silently, bare feet silent on the packed dirt, and eased the rough plank door open just wide enough to slip through. The humid air wrapped around him immediately, thick and warm, carrying the scent of turned earth and distant rain. Patrols were light tonight, most of the overseers drunk on corn liquor after the auction's profits, but Daniel knew the risk. One wrong step, one guard dog catching his scent, and the hounds would be loosed before he could draw breath to scream. Yet the voices drowned out caution, overlapping now in a low chorus that seemed to rise from the ground itself. guiding him forward. He moved low and quick across the yard, keeping to the shadows cast by the smokehouse and the loom house, heart slamming so hard he feared it would betray him. The cotton fields stretched ahead, silvered faintly by starlight, rows upon rows like silent witnesses. Beyond them loomed the woods, dense, tangled, forbidden. Every slave knew the stories, runaways who fled into those trees and were never seen again, their names whispered as warnings around dying fires. But the voices promised something different, something impossible, and grief had hollowed Daniel out until only desperation remained. He reached the tree line and paused, one hand pressed against the rough bark of an ancient oak, breath ragged. The whispers swelled here, clearer and more urgent, weaving through the branches overhead like threads of smoke. They carried fragments of Eliza's lullabies, Ruth's laughter, Josiah's babbling words, sounds so achingly real that tears burned his eyes. The darkness of the woods gaped before him, a living thing swallowing light and sound, yet the voices beckoned from its depths with a certainty that overpowered terror. Daniel stepped forward, leaves crunching softly underfoot, and the canopy closed above him. Branches clawed at his ragged shirt, vines snagging his ankles, but he pressed on, guided by the murmurs that grew ever stronger, drawing him deeper into a place no living soul was meant to go. The air grew cooler, heavier, laced with the rot of centuries and something older still, as if the woods themselves were breathing around him. The woods seemed to tighten around Daniel as he pushed onward, the air growing denser with every step, as though the trees themselves resented his intrusion. Thorns tore at his calves, drawing thin lines of blood that stung in the humid night, but he barely felt them. The whispers had shifted, less urgent now, more coaxing, guiding him along a path that appeared only moments before his footfall, vanishing behind him like breath on glass. Branches that had clawed at him earlier now parted slightly, just enough to let him pass, as if the forest had decided to allow this trespass for reasons of its own. Hours bled away, or perhaps only minutes. Time felt slippery here, stretched thin by the oppressive dark. Then the ground dipped unexpectedly, and Daniel stumbled into a small clearing he had never known existed, though he had worked these lands his entire life. Moonlight, faint and watery, filtered through a break in the canopy, revealing the outline of a structure half swallowed by vines and moss. It was a cabin, ancient and sagging, its logs blackened with age and weather, roof caved in on one side so that saplings grew through the ruin. Kudzu draped over it like a shroud, yet the door hung strangely intact, weathered oak bound with rusted iron. The voices surged as he approached, no longer distant murmurs but a chorus rising from the very earth beneath the cabin, layered and resonant, filling the clearing until the air vibrated. Some spoke in tongues he almost understood, fragments of Gullah songs his grandmother had hummed, words in languages long forbidden on the plantation. Others carried Eliza's soft cadence, Ruth's high-pitched questions, Josiah's sleepy babble, all braided together into a sound that was both comfort and torment. Daniel's breath came shallow and fast, sweat cooled on his skin despite the warmth, raising gooseflesh along his arms. He circled the cabin slowly, wary of collapse, yet drawn irresistibly closer. Through the gaping windows he glimpsed shadows that moved without source, and on the splintered floorboards lay scattered remnants of lives long past, shards of pottery, a rusted kettle, a child's whittled toy half buried in decades of leaf rot. The voices poured from within now, spilling out through cracks and crevices, wrapping around him with increasing clarity. They spoke of hidden things, of passages beneath the soil, of promises kept and broken across generations. Each syllable tugged at the raw edges of his grief, offering glimpses of forgotten histories that felt tied to his own blood in ways he could not yet grasp. Daniel stood before the crooked doorway, hand trembling as it hovered over the latch, the chorus swelling to an almost unbearable intensity, urging him inside where the deepest secrets waited. The cabin breathed with him, vines shifting faintly though no wind stirred, and in that moment he sensed that whatever lay within had been waiting not just for tonight, but for years, perhaps centuries, for someone desperate enough to listen. Daniel hesitated on the threshold, the cabin's darkness yawning before him like an open grave. The voices had quieted to a low thrum, expectant, as though the woods themselves held their breath. He stepped inside, the warped floorboards groaning beneath his weight, and the air shifted, thicker, colder, laced with the musty scent of earth long undisturbed. Dust motes danced in the faint moonlight slanting through the collapsed roof, illuminating motes that seemed to drift against the natural flow of air. His eyes adjusted slowly, picking out the remnants of a hearth blackened by ancient fires, a splintered table overturned in one corner, and strange markings etched into the log walls, symbols that twisted like roots, unfamiliar yet disturbingly alive. Then the shadows moved. Not the lazy shift of branches outside, but a deliberate coalescing in the far corner, where the gloom was deepest. A figure took shape, tall and lean, cloaked in darkness that clung too closely to be mere absence of light. It stood motionless at first, head tilted as if listening to the same whispers that had drawn Daniel here. When it stepped forward, the floor did not creak beneath its weight, no dust rose, no vines stirred. Moonlight touched its face, or where a face should have been, and revealed only smooth emptiness, like polished river stone, yet Daniel felt the weight of its gaze as surely as chains. The voices swelled again, but now they spoke through the figure, words forming in the air with a resonance that bypassed his ears and settled directly in his chest. It named him Daniel, though he had uttered no sound, and the sound of his own name in that hollow timbre sent ice through his veins. It spoke of guardianship, of debts unpaid across centuries, of a bargain struck long ago when blood had soaked these woods to feed something older than the plantation, older than the ships that crossed the sea. The figure extended one hand, long fingers unfolding like pale branches, and in its palm lay a single object, a small iron key, rusted yet gleaming faintly with an inner light. The offer came not in words but in understanding that flooded Daniel's mind unbidden. Guidance through the hidden paths, knowledge of where Eliza and the children had been taken, a chance slim, perilous, to reach them before the trails grew cold. In exchange, a task, to retrieve something buried deeper in the woods, something the guardian could no longer touch, something that had begun to wake and hunger. Refusal meant turning back into the night alone, the voices falling silent forever. Acceptance meant stepping further into a compact whose terms were only half revealed, whose price would be extracted in ways he could not yet foresee. Daniel stared at the outstretched hand, the key pulsing faintly like a heartbeat not his own. The cabin walls seemed to lean inward, the symbols glowing dimly now, and the chorus of whispers rose in encouragement or warning. His fingers trembled as they hovered, inches from the iron, every instinct screaming to flee while grief and love whispered that this was the only door left open to him. The figure waited, patient as stone, the weight of untold years pressing down in the silence between them. The key rested cold and heavy in Daniel's palm, its edges biting into his skin as though reluctant to be carried. The figure dissolved into shadow the moment the bargain was sealed, leaving only the faint echo of its presence and the sudden hush of the voices, now satisfied, now waiting. Daniel stepped back into the night, the cabin door creaking shut behind him of its own accord. The path that had guided him here reappeared, narrower now, winding deeper into the woods where the trees grew older and stranger, their trunks twisted into shapes that hurt the eye to follow. He walked for what felt like hours, the key pulsing faintly against his chest where he had tucked it beneath his shirt. The air grew damper, richer with the smell of standing water and decaying vegetation. Then the ground sloped downward, and the trees thinned just enough to reveal a ravine hidden beneath layers of vine and moss. At its bottom, half concealed by overhanging roots, yawned the mouth of a tunnel rough-hewn timber supports long rotted, yet somehow still holding against the weight of the earth. Faint light flickered from within, not firelight but something paler, colder, dancing across the walls like moonlight on water though no moon could reach this far. Daniel descended carefully, the key growing warmer with every step. The tunnel widened into a chamber, its floor littered with remnants of hurried flight, a child's rag doll, a broken lantern, scraps of cloth that might once have been quilts. Markings covered the walls here too, handprints in faded charcoal, symbols like those in the cabin but fresher, more desperate. This was no forgotten relic, it had been used, and recently. The voices returned, softer now, threading through the stone itself, guiding him past side passages that breathed damp air and distant drips. Deeper still, the network branched like roots, a labyrinth carved by generations of the desperate seeking freedom northward. But something else moved here too. Shadows detached themselves from the walls, sliding along the edges of his vision, tall, thin, jointed wrong. Whispers that were not the guiding chorus rose and fell, speaking in tones of hunger and loss. Cold spots bloomed suddenly, stealing the breath from his lungs, and once he felt fingers brush the back of his neck though he walked alone. The key burned now, a steady heat against his skin, and the eerie lights intensified, revealing glimpses of figures standing motionless in alcoves, waiting, watching, neither fully gone nor fully present. The air thickened with unexplained weight, as though sorrow itself had pooled here over decades, fermenting into something that watched and waited. Every footstep echoed strangely, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly in rhythm with his heart. Daniel pressed onward, driven by the promise held in the iron key and the fragile hope of finding a way to his family, even as the phenomena around him grew bolder, more insistent, brushing against the edges of his sanity with cold, unseen hands. The tunnel narrowed until Daniel's shoulders brushed both walls, the damp stone leaching warmth from his skin with every passing moment. The pale lights that had guided him flickered erratically now, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched ahead like fingers reaching for something just out of sight. The key against his chest throbbed in steady rhythm, almost painfully hot, yet he dared not remove it. The whispers of the guiding chorus had faded to a distant hum, leaving only the drip of water and his own ragged breathing to fill the silence. Then the air changed, grew heavier, charged, as though a storm pressed down from above though he walked far beneath the earth. He turned a sharp corner and froze. The shadows along the walls detached themselves with deliberate slowness, peeling away from the stone like ink poured into water. They rose, elongated, forming shapes that mimicked human form yet defied it, limbs too long, joints bending at impossible angles, heads tilting with a curiosity that felt predatory. No features marked their faces, only smooth voids where eyes and mouths should have been, yet Daniel felt them watching, weighing, tasting the fear that surged through him. One drifted closer, its edges fraying and reforming, and the temperature plummeted until his breath clouded before him in frantic puffs. It hovered inches away, silent, but he heard its voice all the same, not in his ears, but deeper, in the marrow of his bones, whispering fragments of betrayal, of promises broken long ago in this very place. Another shadow joined the first, then a third, circling him slowly, their movements synchronized yet independent, as though each obeyed a different will. The walls themselves seemed to ripple in response, the charcoal handprints glowing faintly with a sickly luminescence. Cold fingers, not flesh, not quite air, brushed his cheek, tracing the line of a tear he had not realized he shed. The touch left a trail of frost that burned. Images flooded his mind unbidden, faces of runaways who had passed this way, eyes wide with hope that curdled into despair, overseers long dead, mouths twisted in cruel laughter, blood seeping into soil that drank it greedily. The shadows fed on memory, on pain, growing denser with every recollection they pulled from him. Daniel stumbled backward, back pressing against the rough wall, but the shadows followed, unhurried, inevitable. One stretched upward, merging with the low ceiling, blotting out the pale lights until only its silhouette remained, vast and looming. The key seared now, a brand against his skin, and for a moment he thought it might anchor him, ward them off, but the shadows only leaned closer, curious about the heat, about the bargain it represented. Their whispers overlapped, a cacophony of secrets, names of the betrayed, dates of massacres buried in these woods, oaths sworn in desperation and broken by greed. The air thickened until breathing felt like drawing water into his lungs, and the boundaries between stone and shadow, between past and present, began to blur. The entities pressed nearer, their void faces inches from his own, drinking in the raw edge of his grief as though it were sustenance long denied. The shadows recoiled as suddenly as they had come, peeling away into the walls with a sound like wind rushing through dry leaves. Daniel gasped, sliding down the stone until he sat hunched on the cold floor, the key's heat the only warmth left in his body. His mind reeled from the onslaught of borrowed memories, faces, screams, betrayals that were not his own yet clung to him like burrs. Then, without warning, the tunnel faded, the damp air thinned, and he was elsewhere. He stood in a clearing much like the one with the cabin, but younger, the trees smaller, the soil freshly turned. Torchlight flickered from a circle of figures cloaked in rough-woven cloth, their faces painted with ash and blood. At the center lay a stone altar, slick and dark, and upon it a woman, his own features echoed in her high cheekbones, the set of her eyes. She struggled against bindings of vine and iron, but her gaze was steady, defiant even as the blade rose. Words spilled from the circled figures in a tongue both foreign and familiar, a plea or a bargain, he could not tell. When the blade fell, the ground drank deeply, and something vast stirred beneath, uncoiling with a satisfaction that shook the roots of the trees. The vision shifted. Generations flashed by in heartbeats, his grandmother as a child, hiding in the quarters as patrols passed, his mother whispering warnings about the woods, about blood that called to blood, himself as a boy, dreaming of voices he thought were angels. Each scene carried the same thread, a promise made in desperation when the first ships came, a ritual to protect the stolen from worse fates, but twisted over time into a chain heavier than any iron. The land remembered. The woods remembered. And the debt had passed down, silent and unseen, until it settled on him the day the gavel cracked and took his family. Another flash, Eliza's face, pale and drawn, in a distant holding pen, Ruth curled small against her, Josiah reaching for a mother who could not hold him close enough. They were alive, but the trail was cooling, and something followed them even there, drawn by the same ancient hunger. The visions pressed the truth into him. The curse was not punishment but tether, binding his blood to the entity that had been fed that night long ago. To break it, to reach his family, he would have to confront what his ancestors had awakened, feed it or starve it, pay or renegotiate a bargain struck before he was born. The tunnel swam back into focus, the walls solid again, the shadows quiescent but watching. Daniel rose slowly, legs trembling, the weight of centuries settling on his shoulders alongside his own grief. The key burned steady now, no longer merely hot but alive with purpose, guiding him deeper into the debt his blood had inherited. The tunnel opened abruptly into a small, domed chamber where the air felt strangely lighter, as though the weight of the earth above had momentarily lifted. Pale light seeped from cracks in the ceiling, filtering down like weak sunlight through water, illuminating a clearing of sorts, an unnatural hollow beneath the roots of an ancient cypress whose trunk rose through the stone like a pillar. Daniel paused at the entrance, the key's heat easing for the first time since he had taken it, allowing him to draw a full breath. The guiding whispers returned, softer now, almost tender, leading his gaze to the far side where a small figure huddled against the curved wall. Ruth. She sat curled into herself, knees drawn to her chest, dressed in the same faded dress she had worn on the auction block, now torn and dirt-streaked. Her braids had come partly undone, ribbons lost, but it was unmistakably her, his daughter, impossibly here in this buried place. Daniel's heart lurched so violently he staggered forward, whispering her name though his throat closed around it. Ruth lifted her head at the sound, eyes wide and shining with tears, and for a moment the chamber filled with the purity of recognition. "Papa," she breathed, voice small and trembling, and she scrambled to her feet, running the few steps into his arms. He dropped to his knees, gathering her close, feeling the fragile warmth of her body, the rapid beat of her heart against his own. She smelled of earth and fear, but beneath it the faint sweetness that was only hers, and he buried his face in her hair, tears soaking the tangled strands. Questions tumbled through his mind. How had she come here? Had she escaped? Had the voices brought her to? But they dissolved in the overwhelming relief of holding her again. Ruth clung to him with desperate strength, small hands fisting in his shirt, whispering over and over that she had been so scared, that Mama had told her to be brave, that she had followed lights in the dark just like he had. For a fleeting span, the chamber felt almost safe, the horrors of the tunnels held at bay by the simple miracle of reunion. Daniel rocked her gently, murmuring promises he barely believed himself, that he would find Eliza and Josiah, that they would all be together again. Ruth nodded against his chest, trusting in the way only children can, and the moment stretched, fragile and golden. Then the air shifted. A low rumble rolled through the earth, distant hounds baying in answer, growing louder with terrifying speed. Torchlight flickered at the tunnel mouth, harsh, orange, human. Voices shouted, coarse and triumphant, the crack of whips echoing down the passage. Slave catchers, drawn impossibly through the labyrinth, guided by something that wore their greed like a mask. Ruth stiffened in his arms, a whimper escaping her lips, and Daniel pulled her tighter, mind racing for escape. The guiding whispers fractured into frantic urgency, overlapping with newer, darker tones that savored the approaching hunt. The pale light dimmed as shadows stirred again at the edges, and Daniel realized with sinking dread that the woods had allowed this interruption deliberately, balancing the gift of his daughter against the price of pursuit. The hound's howls sharpened, boots thundering closer, and the fragile reunion shattered under the weight of what still hunted them both. The hound's baying echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling underground, torchlight licking the tunnel walls as the catchers closed in. Daniel scooped Ruth into his arms, her small body trembling against his chest, and bolted toward the only passage still shrouded in darkness. The guiding whispers fractured into urgency, overlapping with sharper, mocking tones that seemed to delight in the chase. He ran blindly at first, Ruth's weight a fierce anchor to reality, her whispered papa the only thing keeping terror from swallowing him whole. The tunnel twisted upward, roots snagging at his ankles, the air growing fouler with each desperate stride. The key burned hotter than ever, searing through his shirt, and the voices converged into a single, insistent directive: deeper, not out. He veered into a side passage he had not noticed before, narrower and older, its walls slick with moisture that gleamed like fresh blood in the faltering light. The sounds of pursuit faded behind a sudden bend, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by his labored breathing and Ruth's muffled sobs. Then the passage opened into a small hollow beneath the roots of a massive tree, the earth here disturbed and soft, as though recently turned. The key's heat became unbearable, pulsing in rhythm with the ground itself, and the whispers coalesced into clarity: dig. Daniel set Ruth down gently, pressing her against the wall with a silent plea to stay still, and dropped to his knees. His fingers clawed at the soil, damp and loamy, yielding with unnatural ease. Deeper he went, nails splitting, earth packing beneath them, until his hands struck something hard and cold. He unearthed a small iron box, no larger than a loaf of bread, its surface etched with the same twisting symbols that marked the cabin and tunnels. The lid resisted at first, rusted hinges screaming as he forced it open with the key itself. Inside lay an artifact, neither stone nor metal, but something in between, smooth and black, veined with faint crimson that glowed when the key touched it. The moment his fingers closed around it, power surged through him like lightning through dry wood, sharp and exhilarating and wrong. Visions flashed, paths unfolding across distant plantations, Eliza's weary face turning as though sensing him, Josiah's small hand reaching out in dream. The voices roared in approval, promising that this was the means, the impossible made flesh. With it, bonds could be traced across miles, chains could be weakened, separations undone. But even as the knowledge flooded him, a deeper rumble shook the hollow, and the crimson veins brightened hungrily. Shadows stirred at the edges of sight, thicker now, coalescing into a single vast presence that uncoiled slowly from the earth itself. Eyes opened in the darkness, too many, too ancient, fixing on the artifact with a ravenous patience that had waited centuries. Ruth whimpered, pressing closer, and Daniel felt the malevolent attention shift to her, to him, tasting the fresh desperation the object had awakened. The power hummed in his grasp, intoxicating, but the cost revealed itself in that gaze. The entity stirred fully now, no longer content to sleep beneath ritual and blood debt. It wanted more, wanted everything, and the artifact was both key and bait. The chamber trembled as the presence rose, the air thickening with the scent of old sacrifice, and Daniel clutched the thing tighter, caught between the promise of reunion and the awakening horror that demanded payment in full. The distant baying of hounds had faded into an unnatural hush, yet the hollow trembled still, the vast presence uncoiling beneath the earth like smoke given weight. Daniel clutched the black artifact to his chest, its crimson veins pulsing in time with his own frantic heart, while Ruth pressed against his side, small fingers digging into his arm. The shadows that had watched before now gathered with purpose, forming a loose ring around them, their void faces turned toward the spot where the guardian figure had first appeared. It materialized again, stepping from the darkness as though the air itself parted for it, taller now, edges sharper, the smooth absence of its face reflecting the artifact's glow like polished obsidian. The temperature plummeted further, frost blooming across the roots overhead, and Daniel felt the bargain shift beneath him, the terms rewriting themselves in the silence. The figure extended its hand once more, but this time the gesture carried no offer, only demand. The key in his pocket grew ice-cold, a counterweight to the burning artifact, and understanding crashed through him with brutal clarity. The Guardian had never been bound to help, it had been bound to balance. Every step deeper into the woods, every acceptance of guidance, had been a feeding. The reunion with Ruth, the unearthing of the artifact, gifts calculated to heighten desperation, to ripen the grief it craved. Now, with the ancient entity fully roused by the artifact's touch, the Guardian revealed its true role, not protector of the hidden paths, but jailer of the thing below, sustained by the blood debt his ancestors had paid and renewed through every soul who bargained in despair. Daniel's acceptance of the key had been the final invitation, his love for his family the perfect bait. The figure spoke without moving, words forming inside his skull like splinters of glass. It named the price. The artifact must be returned, the entity placated with fresh surrender, his life, or Ruth's, freely given to seal the awakening hunger back into sleep. Refusal meant the woods themselves would deliver them to the approaching catchers, or worse, to the thing now rising. The shadows tightened their circle, brushing against Ruth with curious malice, and she whimpered, burying her face in his side. Daniel's grip on the artifact tightened until his knuckles ached. Power still thrummed through it, promising paths to Eliza and Josiah, promising strength to fight, but every pulse fed the presence below, widening the cracks in the earth. The Guardian waited, patient as centuries, while frost crept across the floor toward their feet. Ruth's trembling shook him to his core, and rage, hot, blinding, rose against the betrayal that had worn the mask of hope. He shifted his stance, placing himself fully between his daughter and the figure, the artifact's glow casting long shadows that danced like mocking laughter. The chamber quaked as the entity below pushed harder, roots snapping overhead, and Daniel met the Guardian's empty gaze with a defiance born of a father's breaking heart. The true confrontation began not with weapons or pleas, but with the raw refusal to surrender what little he had left, even as the darkness closed in to claim it. The earth shuddered violently beneath Daniel's feet, a deep, rolling groan rising through the roots as though the woods themselves were drawing breath after centuries of silence. Rain began to fall outside, sudden, torrential, slashing through the canopy in sheets that turned the hollows in trance into a roaring waterfall. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough to rattle his teeth, and lightning strobed through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating the Guardian's featureless face in stark white flashes. The artifact burned hotter in his grip, its crimson veins flaring with each thunderclap, feeding the storm or fed by it, he could no longer tell. The shadows that had ringed them exploded into motion, no longer drifting but writhing, stretching upward to merge with the storm's fury seeping through the soil. Trees outside bent nearly double, their trunks creaking in agony, while roots overhead snapped and whipped like living serpents. The air filled with voices, not whispers now, but a cacophony that rose and fell with the wind, some pleading, some accusing, some singing fragments of lullabies Eliza had hummed to the children. They manifested in flickers around him, translucent figures caught mid-stride, faces twisted in eternal flight, runaways long dead, their eyes locking onto Daniel with desperate recognition before dissolving into rain and shadow. Ruth screamed as a spectral hand reached for her, passing harmlessly through her shoulder yet leaving frost on her skin. Daniel pulled her behind him, backing against the trembling wall, the artifact raised like a talisman though he felt its power turning wild, unpredictable. The Guardian remained unmoved at the center, arms spread now, drawing the storm deeper into the hollow until water poured in rivulets down the walls, carrying leaf rot and the copper scent of old blood. Lightning struck again, closer, and for an instant the entire chamber blazed daylight bright, revealing hundreds of faces pressed against the inside of the earth, watching, waiting, mouths open in silent howls. The boundary between guidance and torment vanished. One moment a voice like Eliza's brushed his ear, urging him to run north, promising safety. The next, the same voice twisted into a snarl, revealing the path as a trap leading straight to chains. Figures lunged from the storm, some offering hands to pull him deeper, others clawing at his legs to drag him down. Ruth clung to him, sobbing, as cold rain soaked them both, the water rising ankle deep, thick with mud and fragments of bone. The artifact screamed in his hand, a high keening that matched the wind, its light strobing wildly between crimson and void black. Reality fractured under the onslaught. Daniel saw Eliza's face in the rain, felt Josiah's small weight in his arms, one heartbeat and nothing the next. The woods had come fully alive, storm and spirits and ancient hunger braided together into a single roaring entity that blurred illusion from truth, past from present, salvation from damnation. Every flash of lightning revealed new horrors or fleeting hopes, the voices shifting from guides to tormentors and back again in the space of a breath, leaving him reeling, unable to trust sight or sound or the desperate beat of his own heart. The chamber buckled, earth cascading from above, as the storm's heart descended to claim what had been promised long ago. The storm reached its peak as the chamber buckled, earth and water cascading in torrents that threatened to bury them alive. Daniel held Ruth tight against his chest, the artifact blazing in his fist like a captured star, its crimson light cutting through the chaos. Lightning speared through the fractured ceiling, striking the black object directly, and power surged through him raw, ancient, unstoppable. In that blinding instant, he understood the true nature of the bargain, not to feed the entity, nor to serve the guardian, but to wrest control from both. He thrust the artifact skyward, channeling every fragment of grief, love, and rage that had carried him this far. The voices, guides, tormentors, ancestors aligned in a single, thunderous chord, no longer fractured but unified under his will. The storm answered, wind howling through the hollow in a vortex that centered on him. Shadows shrieked as they were torn from the walls, drawn into the artifact's glow, compressed into threads of darkness that fed its light instead of the hunger below. The guardian staggered, form fraying at the edges, empty face cracking like old stone as the power it had hoarded for centuries reversed its flow. The vast presence beneath the earth roared in fury, roots exploding upward in a bid to reclaim what was slipping away, but Daniel stood unmoved, Ruth's small hand clutched in his free one anchoring him against the pull. He spoke, "No," commanded in a voice that carried the weight of every soul that had ever fled through these woods. The artifact shattered the old debt, rewriting it in fire and storm. The land would no longer drink blood for passage, the paths would open for the desperate without price. Light erupted outward, a silent detonation that raced through the tunnels, the woods, the very soil of the plantation. Chains far beyond the storm's reach grew brittle and snapped, hidden trails illuminated for those who would follow. Eliza, miles away, lifted her head as an inexplicable warmth flooded her chest, Josiah stirring in her arms with a sudden, trusting smile. The guardian dissolved into harmless mist, its purpose ended. The entity below retreated, wounded and diminished, sinking back into uneasy slumber. Water receded as suddenly as it had come, the storm peeling away to reveal a sky washed clean and starlit. The hollow steadied, roots knitting together overhead like healing scars. Daniel lowered his arm, the artifact now dull and cracked, its power spent but its work done. Ruth looked up at him, eyes wide with wonder rather than fear, and he felt the impossible settle into reality. A way forward had been carved, not just for them, but for countless others. He lifted her gently, stepping over fallen earth toward the newly revealed passage that breathed cool night air. The voices lingered now as faint, grateful echoes, no longer binding but blessing, guiding them toward reunion and a freedom bought at the cost of confronting the darkest heart of the land itself. The woods parted before them, silent and reverent, as father and daughter emerged into a world forever altered by one man's refusal to surrender his family to despair.